Good day, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Military and Foreign Affairs Network. I am your host, the voice of reason. Well, today we're continuing our ongoing coverage of the war between the Russian Federation and Ukraine. Now, we can tell you, as of today, the situation is becoming incredibly dire for Ukrainian forces. You can see the narrative that is coming out of Washington, comments by the Secretary of Defense, commenting on the situation on the front line, and the continuing strengthening of Russian capability against Ukrainian forces. And not just against Ukrainian forces, the planning for a possibility that the Russians believe they will ultimately have to engage forces of the combined Western powers. Now, furthermore, we are seeing the French narrative, the French discussion about intervening in this conflict, in this war. We're hearing more and more from the French. That is a possibility. I remember in my previous video, I had discussed that the French could deploy forces under the pretext of a humanitarian and training mission to Western Ukraine. Now, I want to read you an article that that just came out in Newsweek. Here we go. French troops are ready for the toughest engagements, the commander of the country's ground forces has said, as President Emmanuel Macron mulls an official military deployment to Ukraine despite repeated Russian threats of retaliation. In an op-ed published by French daily Le Monde on Tuesday, General Perry Schill, France's ground forces chief, said his forces are ready if called upon, and that a display of French military muscle would deter any attack on France. Macron is at the forefront of a proposal by a handful of NATO nations to discuss sending allied forces into Ukraine in training and advisory roles, though not as combat troops. The Baltic states of Estonia, Lithuania, and Latvia, as well as Poland, have expressed support of Paris's position, though large NATO states like the United States and Germany are opposed for now. Remember what I had discussed. France deploys forces under the guise of a humanitarian and training mission in Western Ukraine, and at some point there is an engagement. That engagement would then change the position of the United States and possibly Germany. I doubt Germany, but the United States in terms of direct military intervention. Hence, World War III. Schill in France, we're back to the article, I apologize. Schill said France could engage a division of 20,000 troops within 30 days to operate as part of an allied coalition. Paris, he added, would be able to command a force of around 60,000 soldiers made up of French and other allied troops. The French army comprises some 121,000 soldiers with 24,000 reservists. If you want peace, prepare for war, the general wrote. So there we have it. Now, the initial plan by the French would be the deployment of some 2,000 troops into Western Ukraine. But you can see the French are now contingency planning for the deployment of 20,000 troops after that 2,000 troop force is sent. Why are they contingency planning for that? Because they believe at some point that force is going to engage Russian forces or be engaged by Russian forces. This is out of the purview. This is outside the scope of a NATO mandate. This is not what the North Atlantic Treaty Organization was designed for. But at the same time, we have seen in the past, NATO forces engage those of Serbia, Libya, and other nation states. So again, the concept that NATO is simply designed to defend its member states is false. It has been used in the past as a force of what the Russians perceive as aggression. And they're standing for the Russians to believe that. Now, if the French deploy these forces to Western Ukraine, it is highly likely the Russians are going to target those forces. Ukraine is not part of NATO. So how they are going to spin this when the French are attacked in Western Ukraine to then receive NATO support in Western Ukraine for that unauthorized deployment of French troops to Western Ukraine is really going to be reaching for it. But again, the uninformed urbanite in London, Washington, San Francisco, Chicago, Miami, mega cities throughout the United States, all the American people, or a large percentage of the American people, are going to hear and believe is that NATO forces were attacked in Ukraine, resulting in a U.S. response against Russia. And there we go into World War III. Why is this happening? Why are the French believing that they need to send forces? Why does the West believe they need to send forces into Ukraine now? Because the Russians are defeating Ukrainian forces. Within the last 20 days, the Russian Air Force has struck more than 900 aim points with GLONASS glide bombs. The Russian doctrine has changed. The Russian military industrial complex has ramped up. It is causing significant casualties against Ukrainian forces. Whereas before, we were seeing the use, or the large use, of Russian ground forces taking casualties against Ukrainian ground forces. We are now seeing the Russian doctrine change, and they are using their air power to devastate Ukrainian forces all along the front lines. In some sense, the Russians, are changing their doctrine, especially their Air Force, more in line with what and how the U.S. operates. So the Ukrainians in the West are getting a taste of something that is incredibly unpleasant. the Russians are systematically destroying the Ukrainian military at distance without taking significant casualties. 900 aim points. Compounding that, the Russian military continues to expand. There are some reports that indicate that in about 5 years, maybe less, the Russian military in 2027, 2026 could look more like a late-era Soviet military with new doctrine changes that make it a much more threatening adversary for the West. So the rhetoric is increasing. As I've talked about before, we are steadily heading towards global war. And in all likelihood, that will at some point include China, Iran, North Korea, and other nation states as well. This could be becoming very fastly a conflict that resembles a World War scenario. So there you have it. More to come. As always, thank you for joining us. Have a good day.